Right now, we can all tell that the economy is not recovering. Well, what's supposed to happen in recovery? Well, people are supposed to go out and spend money, and that would stimulate demand, and that would have the capitalists see a potential for profit, so they will invest and then hire people. Those people will go and spend their income on goods and services, stimulating growth, and then they can be taxed and whatnot. That's exactly what needs to happen in order to recover the economy. Unfortunately, that's not happening right now. So there's two schools of thought on how to end this. First is the Austarians. They say decrease public debt, cut real wages, end government spending, pay down the debt as much as possible, and worry about people and the things people need for later. Then on the other side, you have the Keynesians, who say keep interest rates low, have government spending to stimulate demand, have the government spend money to create a demand, then the capitalists go out, hire people, people get hired, they spend their disposable income, and then other capitalists see that, and then that starts up the production cycle all over again. And also add this, expanding the money supply. However, the debate between these two ideas continues because they're not working. Even with negative interest rates, when you actually count in the inflation and quantitative easing, banks still aren't giving out the money because they still have bad debts on themselves and they still have weak balance sheets. Many corporations are flush with cash that they are not turning around and using to reinvest, at least reinvest at levels that would be sufficient to recover the economy. So they don't need to take any more loans. Now some Keynesians are calling for some unorthodox measures, like some found in modern money theory. One of those ideas is to have the central bank loan out the money directly. In other words, go around the private banks and loan the money straight out itself. This is called helicopter money. The term was coined by Ben Bernanke. Now, he was not explicitly saying that we should do this. He was saying that this was something that could happen. So he wasn't outright advocating that it should be done. The government is saying increase spending by issuing bonds. Now, instead of those bonds being purchased by private banks or pension funds or what have you, have them be purchased by the central bank itself. Basically, bypass the entire private banking system and give it directly out to the small businesses and people who want to borrow it. The amount of money that would go out in the economy would be smaller than what would actually go out through another round of quantitative easing, because there would be no chance for a private bank to hold it like they're doing now and refusing to give it out. Believe it or not, this is actually not a new idea. It was actually formulated in the 1930s in what was called the Chicago Plan by a bunch of economists at the University of Chicago. Some of these economists actually included Milton Friedman and Keynes. The theory is this would actually take care of a lot of the defects in private credit and private debit, a lot about the system that makes it inherently unstable and almost frankly stupid in a kind of way. In fact, this idea is now being revived on a working paper by the International Monetary Fund. The Chicago Plan calls for taking the creation of money from a primarily private sector thing to making it exclusively a public sector thing. One advantage of this would be the fact that we would go from having a national debt to having a national surplus. Because under the Chicago Plan, banks have to borrow reserves from the Treasury to fully back liabilities. The government acquires a very large asset vis-a-vis banks. Our analysis finds that the government is left with a much lower, in fact, negative net debt burden. The IMF estimates that the total liabilities of the U.S. financial system, including those created by the shadow banking system, to be 200% of the GDP. Now this would create a windfall. It would be used for a large buyback of public debts, about 100% of the GDP. The central bank creates the money. The government can buy back bank assets, lowering the net debt of the government. This means private banks would lose the ability to create deposits by creating a loan. This means they would all have to be backed by either public debt or actual bank deposits. This would mean private banks lose the ability to create deposits by making a loan, which means they would all have to be backed by either bank profits or by public debt. The control of credit growth would become much more straightforward because banks would no longer be able, as they are today, to generate their own funding. Deposits in the act of lending, an extraordinary privilege that is not enjoyed by any other type of business, says the IMF paper. Rather, banks would become what many erroneously believe them to be today, pure intermediaries that depend on obtaining outside funding before it's able to lend. There is, however, a drawback. If the bank is the only one who can expand any reserves, banks would be reduced to doing speculative work like hedge funds in order to create the revenue that they actually need. Now, they would be doing this on a much greater level. Now, this would end up causing even more instability in the system. The only way for the Chicago plan to work is if the banks were taken over by the government and be made part of an overall investment scheme and a planning of the banking system. But then the entire banking system would be nationalized. Good. Creating money out of thin air means that the money supply can grow out of sync with creation in the real economy. In other words, commodity production. If physical commodity production doesn't actually expand, then this will lead to inflation in prices. It will also lead to a great deal of financial asset speculation. The real incomes of workers will actually be hit with higher prices rather than falling employment. Keynesians deny this. What they believe is that when the government spends money, it increases aggregate demand, and that in turn makes it profitable for capitalists to return to business because the government's spending money. It is here that we find the flaw in the Keynesian model. For Keynesians, increasing the money supply means an increase of employment, and then those people are employed and they start spending money, and that sends everything into repair. But the reality of capitalism is actually the other way around. Only if profitability is sufficient will capitalists invest and then hire workers, and then so on, repairing the economy. The profitability for investment must be there first. This does not come into existence by merely creating more money. You have an expansion of the economy because of an increased demand, and that stimulates a growth in money correspondingly. Artificially creating fiat money from the government does not get around this problem, as we have already seen through 3 failed rounds of quantitative easing. The Chicago plan of just bypassing the private banks will not lead to a sustainable growth or a sustainable system. It will end in one of two things: either financial asset speculation that gets out of control, or just plain increase in the cost of goods in stores. If we bypass the banking system, the capitalist mode of production will just be thrown into even greater chaos than it is now. It is not the banking system that needs to be bypassed. It's the capitalist mode of production for profit that we need to bypass. We need a common ownership of the means of production to produce for society what it needs, not for profit that leads to the anarchy of capitalist production.